If you are Chinese, there's one question that sounds simple but becomes much harder the deeper scientists look into it. Where did the people who built the foundations of Chinese civilization actually come from? For generations, the answer seemed almost obvious. Ancient societies developed along the great rivers of China, powerful kingdoms appeared, dynasties rose and disappeared, and the people of China continued carrying their civilization forward. But when scientists started comparing the DNA of modern Chinese populations with genomes from people who lived thousands of years ago, the story became far more complicated. The DNA did not show one ancient population remaining unchanged from the beginning of civilization until today. Instead, it revealed a huge network of populations that moved, mixed, separated, expanded, and eventually became connected. And one of the biggest surprises is that the genetic history of the Chinese people is not really a single origin story at all. It is a story about several ancient population centers, with the Yellow River playing a major role, but with southern China, northeastern Asia, the Tibetan Plateau, and other regions contributing important layers as well. That immediately creates a much bigger mystery. If modern Chinese ancestry was not created by one ancient population, then who were the people who actually shaped it? Were the farmers of the Yellow River the main ancestors of modern Chinese populations? Did the rice-growing populations of the Yangtze contribute just as much? Did northern communities move south and replace the people who were already living there, or did the two populations mix? Did populations from the northeast contribute to the ancestry of people farther south? And what happened in the thousands of years before the first Chinese dynasties appeared in written history? Ancient DNA is now allowing researchers to investigate these questions in a way that earlier historians could not. Instead of relying only on pottery, burial styles, tools, language, or written records, scientists can compare the actual genomes of ancient individuals with modern populations. And when those genomes are placed on a map, a surprising pattern appears. The genetic history of China looks less like one straight line and more like a giant river system with many tributaries. There is an important distinction before we continue. The phrase Chinese people does not describe one genetically uniform group. Modern China contains many different populations with different histories, including Han Chinese, Tibetans, Mongolians, Uyghurs, Zhuang, Hui, Manchu, Yi, and many others. Even among Han Chinese, there are strong regional differences. Northern Han populations tend to be more closely related to ancient Northern East Asian populations and people associated with the Yellow River. Southern Han populations generally show more genetic affinity with populations from southern China and Southeast Asia. Central Han populations often sit somewhere between the two. Modern genomic studies have repeatedly found this broad north-to-south genetic gradient. That gradient is not simply a modern phenomenon created by recent travel or urbanization. It reflects much older population history. Geography, migration, agriculture, political expansion, and ancient contact all helped create the pattern that scientists can still see in DNA today. To understand why this happened, we have to go back before the first emperors, before the Great Wall as we know it, before the Qin and Han dynasties, and even before the rise of the earliest complex states. What is now China was already home to many different human communities. In the north, people developed farming systems centered heavily on millet. Along the Yangtze and farther south, rice agriculture became increasingly important. In the northeast, communities occupied the West Liao and Amur River systems. On the Tibetan Plateau, populations adapted to an extreme high-altitude environment. Farther west, the landscape connected China with Central Asia. These regions were not isolated islands. People moved between them, but not always at the same speed or in the same direction. Some communities remained relatively local for long periods. Others expanded quickly. And every one of these movements could change the genetic composition of the population that came afterward. The Yellow River is one of the most important pieces of this puzzle. The basin became a major center of millet agriculture in early complex societies. Communities grew larger, permanent settlements became common, and social organization became increasingly sophisticated. But the people who lived there thousands of years ago were not simply modern Chinese living in an earlier period. They belonged to ancient populations with their own genetic identities. They lived before the Han dynasty, before modern ideas of Chinese ethnicity, and before the political unity that later connected enormous territories. What matters is that ancient DNA shows that these Yellow River populations contributed substantial ancestry to later people living across northern and central China. In other words, the Yellow River was not just culturally important, it was also a major source of ancestry. This is one of the first big reveals. Researchers studying ancient genomes have found that populations associated with the Yellow River around the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods contributed strongly to modern northern Han Chinese ancestry. Their genetic influence also extended beyond the Central Plain and into other regions. This helps explain why northern Han populations are genetically closer to ancient northern farming communities than many southern populations are. But it does not mean that all modern Chinese ancestry comes from the Yellow River. That is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The same genetic evidence showing strong Yellow River ancestry also reveals that modern Chinese populations contain substantial ancestry from other ancient regions. The further south we travel, the more visible those additional ancestral layers become. The Yangtze River changes the picture completely. Southern China was not an empty territory waiting for northern farmers to arrive. Long before later political expansions, the Yangtze Basin was home to established communities with their own traditions, technologies, and genetic histories. Rice agriculture became one of the defining features of this southern world. Communities expanded around fertile river valleys and wetlands. They developed their own forms of settlement and social organization. As northern populations eventually moved south, they encountered these people. The evidence suggests that the result was not simple replacement. Northern ancestry entered southern populations, but southern ancestry also survived. Their descendants became part of the populations that would later identify culturally with the expanding Chinese world. That is a crucial difference. If the history had been a simple invasion in which northern farmers completely replaced southern populations, modern southern Han Chinese would be genetically much closer to northern populations than they actually are. Instead, the genetic evidence shows a gradient. Southern Han still have major ancestry related to northern populations, but they also carry ancestry connected to ancient southern populations. In other words, the expanding population absorbed local people. Their genes survived inside the new population. Culture and ancestry moved together, but they did not move at exactly the same speed. A political and linguistic identity could spread much farther than one original genetic population could. This process is especially visible in central China. The Central Plain lies between many major population zones, and its history makes it a natural demographic bridge. People moving south from the Yellow River had to pass through or interact with populations farther south. People moving north from the Yangtze entered the same broad region. Rivers connected settlements. Agricultural land encouraged population growth. Political centers attracted workers, soldiers, and migrants. Over centuries, different groups mixed. Modern central Chinese populations often show genetic profiles that look intermediate between northern and southern populations. That is exactly what scientists would expect from a region that experienced repeated movement from both directions. The next clue comes from the northeast. The West Liao River region developed its own farming traditions, especially millet agriculture, and archaeological cultures such as Hongshan became associated with this landscape. Farther north and east, populations along the Amur River followed different economic strategies and maintained distinct genetic histories. Ancient DNA shows that these populations were not permanently isolated. Over time, Yellow River-related ancestry moved north and east, while ancestry connected to the Amur region also influenced populations farther south. The result was a shifting genetic landscape. It was not one population steadily replacing another. Instead, different groups interacted at different periods, sometimes peacefully, sometimes under pressure, and sometimes because economic changes made migration necessary. Why would people move? The answer is not always war. Agriculture can create population pressure because farming communities can support larger numbers of people. When a community grows, young families may expand into nearby regions. Climate can alter rainfall and temperature, making some areas more or less productive. New technologies can make previously difficult environments easier to use. Pastoralism can increase mobility. Political changes can encourage resettlement. Trade can bring people into contact across long distances. All of these factors can change population genetics. That is why the genetic history of ancient China should not be separated from environmental and economic history. People moved because the world around them changed. Then comes another major discovery. Large-scale ancient DNA research has shown that Yellow River-related ancestry was not confined to northern China. It also became a major component of some populations on the Tibetan Plateau. This is surprising because Tibet developed an extremely distinctive human population adapted to life at high altitude. But the genetic connection does not mean Tibetans are simply northern Chinese populations. They are not. Tibetan populations have their own ancient ancestry and their own evolutionary history. The finding simply shows that populations connected to northern China moved into high-altitude regions and became part of the ancestry of later Tibetan communities. Once again, a migrant population entered a new environment mixed with local groups and produced a new genetic combination. This brings us to an important principle of population genetics. Shared ancestry does not mean identical identity. Two populations can share a large amount of ancient ancestry while being culturally and genetically distinct today. Different environments shape populations differently. Isolation can increase genetic differences. Natural selection can favor new adaptations. Languages can change. Political identities can change. In Tibet, northern ancestry became one layer inside a population that developed very different biological adaptations and cultural traditions. The same basic principle operated throughout China. Ancient ancestry moved, but the populations that received it did not necessarily become copies of the people who had moved. Now consider what this means for modern Han Chinese. The Han identity eventually became enormous, but it did not begin as one genetically pure population. It expanded through time. Political states grew, cultural traditions spread, people migrated, local populations were integrated, new communities became part of the larger Han world. The genetic result is exactly what we see today. Strong shared ancestry across Han populations, combined with persistent regional differences. This is not evidence of two completely separate peoples. It is evidence of a large population formed through repeated interaction. One of the most fascinating ancient clues comes from the Central Plain. Ancient individuals from this region, dating to periods before and around the rise of major early states, show genetic similarities that connect them to later northern Han populations. This suggests that substantial components of the genetic structure of northern Chinese populations were already established thousands of years before the Han dynasty. The political identity came later. The ancestry was already there. This distinction is important because people often make the mistake of assuming that an ethnic group begins at exactly the same moment as the name used to describe it. In reality, population history usually comes first. Names, languages, political institutions, and cultural identities develop afterward. That means the ancestors of Han Chinese populations were already living across northern and central China before anyone could have called themselves Han. They farmed, raised families, traded, migrated, and interacted with neighboring groups. Some remained local, others moved. Their descendants eventually became part of a much larger cultural and political identity. When scientists compare ancient DNA with modern genomes, they can see those connections. It is almost like looking backward through layers of a geological record. Each layer represents another stage of population history. The north to south genetic gradient provides another reveal. Modern genomic studies involving thousands of Chinese people show that geography strongly predicts genetic differences. Northern Han populations cluster more closely with one another. Southern Han populations cluster more closely with their neighbors, and central groups often show mixed patterns. The boundary is not sharp, it is a gradual gradient. That matters because it suggests that ancient movement occurred continuously rather than in one simple event. Populations expanded, interacted, and slowly changed. The modern genetic map is therefore the accumulated result of thousands of small and large movements. But there is something even more interesting. The genetic relationship between northern and southern Chinese populations suggests that the expansion of Han culture involved real demographic movement. It was not purely an idea spreading from north to south while populations remained completely separate. People moved, families moved, men moved, women moved, settlements expanded, and ancestry traveled with them. But because local populations also survived and mixed with newcomers, the result was not complete replacement. This is why southern Han populations can simultaneously carry substantial northern ancestry and retain a strong southern genetic component. That pattern has an important implication for how we understand cultural expansion. A language can become dominant even if the population that originally spoke it represents only a fraction of the later population. Political power can accelerate language adoption. Trade networks can spread language. Schools and administration can reinforce it. Religious institutions can contribute. Families can become bilingual before one language eventually becomes dominant. In other cases, migrants can simply become part of an existing population and adopt local languages. Cultural identity and genetic ancestry do not always move together. Chinese history provides many examples of this principle. As political states expanded, they connected regions that had previously been separated. Population movement increased, agricultural settlements moved into new territories, government systems encouraged migration. Over time, local populations became integrated into larger political and cultural structures. Yet the genetic differences created by earlier history did not disappear immediately. They remained visible. That is why modern Chinese people can share an enormous cultural identity while also showing clear regional ancestry patterns. And then there's the western frontier. China was never completely isolated from Central Asia. Ancient trade routes connected populations across the mountains and deserts. Later, the Silk Road became one of the most famous networks in human history, but human contact existed long before the Silk Road had that name. Merchants, pastoralists, soldiers, migrants, and religious travelers crossed between East and West Asia. Some people stayed, others returned home. Most of these migrations were probably small compared with China's enormous population, but small migrations can still leave genetic traces. Some northern Chinese populations show minor West Eurasian-related ancestry under certain genetic models. The proportion is small, but the historical implication is interesting. It suggests that people from farther west reached China and occasionally became part of local populations. This does not mean modern Chinese ancestry is fundamentally Western Eurasian. It is not. The major ancestral structure remains East Asian. The importance of the Western signal is that it records contact. It shows that China was not isolated from the rest of Eurasia. The Tarim Basin provides an even more dramatic example of why DNA can overturn simple migration stories. Ancient mummies discovered in what is now Xinjiang preserved remarkable genetic information because of the region's unusually dry environment. For decades, scholars debated whether these people were migrants from Western Eurasia or descendants of populations connected to the local prehistoric world. Genome-wide analyses showed that the sampled individuals had a deeply local genetic history rather than simply representing recent migrants from the West. This was a major reminder that cultural connections and genetic origins are not always the same thing. People can borrow technologies without being replaced. They can adopt crops from neighbors. They can trade without large-scale migration. They can change language. They can exchange religious ideas. And they can maintain their ancestry. This principle is essential when reconstructing ancient Chinese history because the archaeological record often shows cultural similarities across enormous distances. Those similarities do not automatically prove population replacement. Ancient DNA helps scientists determine when people actually moved and when ideas moved without large demographic changes. Now the story becomes even more complicated when we consider the populations living in southern China before the major expansion of Han culture. Many of these communities had deep local histories and eventually became ancestors of modern southern Chinese populations, and some populations farther into Southeast Asia. Their ancestry did not disappear simply because northern political systems expanded. Instead, it became part of the new population. This is why southern Han genomes remain connected to both northern and southern ancestral sources. It is useful to imagine this as two major rivers meeting. One river flows from the north, carrying ancestry associated with the Yellow River. Another flows from the south, carrying ancestry associated with ancient southern populations. They meet in central China, mix, separate into different tributaries, and continue flowing. Later movements add additional streams. The modern population is the water at the end of the system. You can still identify contributions from different sources, but they are no longer isolated rivers. This metaphor also explains why modern individuals can have very different ancestry proportions, while still belonging to the same broad population. Two people may both be Han Chinese but have different regional histories. One may have ancestors from the north for many generations. Another may have a family history rooted in the south. Another may descend from communities that lived in central China where different ancestry streams met. Their genomes will reflect those histories. Their cultural identity can still be shared. The same principle applies to other populations within modern China. Tibetans have their own genetic history. Uyghurs carry ancestry reflecting the meeting of East and West Eurasian populations. Mongolic-speaking communities connect to northern and eastern steppe histories. Southern Chinese minority groups show deep relationships with populations from Southeast Asia and the southern regions of China. There is no single genetic origin for everyone inside the modern borders of China. So perhaps the better question is not, where did the Chinese people come from? A better question is, which ancient populations contributed to the people living in China today? And how did those populations become connected? That question has a much clearer scientific answer. The Yellow River was one of the most important ancestral centers. The Yangtze in southern China contributed another major layer. The Northeast formed another population network. The Tibetan Plateau developed a distinctive connected history, and Western Eurasia contributed smaller layers through later contact and migration. The modern Han population emerged from interaction among several of these worlds. That is the main genetic reveal. But the story becomes even more interesting when we think about time. Some of the ancestry present in modern Chinese populations is thousands of years old. Other layers were added much later. And some may reflect movements that happened only within the last few thousand years. This means that the modern genome is like an archaeological site. The oldest layers are buried deepest. Later populations are built on top. Some layers are large. Others are thin. But every layer represents people who lived and had descendants. Ancient DNA allows scientists to excavate those genetic layers, and the deeper they go, the older the population story becomes. The earliest communities of East Asia were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. They lived across forests, grasslands, river valleys, and coastal areas. Some were highly mobile. Then agriculture changed everything. Farming allowed larger populations. Larger populations created pressure to expand. Expansion created contact. Contact created mixture. Mixture created new populations. And eventually, some of those populations became major sources of ancestry for the civilizations that followed. The Yellow River farming world is one of the clearest examples, but the same process happened elsewhere. The Yangtze farming world became another center. The Northeast became another. And over time, these regions became increasingly connected. That is why the genetic origin of modern Chinese populations is not one event. It is a sequence. First, ancient hunter-gatherers, then early farmers, then population expansions, then regional interaction, then political integration, then later historical migration, and finally, the modern population. The sequence continues today because human migration never stopped. Urbanization has moved millions of people, marriage networks have expanded, international migration has connected China with the rest of the world. The genetic story of the future will therefore be different from the genetic story of the past. But the ancient layers remain. They do not disappear simply because people move. They continue into descendants. And that is what makes this research so powerful. A person living today can carry DNA inherited from populations that lived before written history. They do not need to know the names of those populations. The genome remembers them anyway. That is why ancient DNA can reveal history that written records never recorded. A farmer from 5,000 years ago may have left no inscription. A woman buried in an ordinary cemetery may have had no political importance. A child who died in a small village may be completely forgotten by history, but their ancestry can survive. Thousands of years later, scientists can identify their descendants. This gives ancient DNA an almost emotional quality. It reconnects people who have no idea they are connected. And China contains an extraordinary number of these stories. The Yellow River communities are one. The Yangtze communities are another. The northern frontier is another. The Tibetan Plateau is another. The coastal regions create additional connections. And the western trade routes add further layers. The complete picture is still unfinished. Some archaeological regions have very few ancient genomes. Others are almost completely unsampled. Southern China is particularly important because DNA preservation can be difficult in warm and humid environments. This means scientists may be missing entire population chapters simply because the genetic material did not survive. Future discoveries could therefore change the current picture. A previously unknown ancient population could turn out to have contributed much more ancestry than anyone expected. A migration thought to have happened late could turn out to be much older. A population thought to have disappeared could be shown to have survived genetically. Or scientists may discover that two populations that seemed separate were actually interacting for thousands of years. Every new genome has the potential to refine the map. And that is why researchers do not consider the story finished. There's another important point. Ancient DNA does not automatically tell us what language people spoke. Scientists can identify ancestry. They can estimate mixture. They can trace population movement. But a genome cannot simply be translated into a language. An individual could have ancestry from one population and speak the language of another. A community could adopt a new language without being genetically replaced. This is why the linguistic history of China must be studied alongside genetics. The spread of Sino-Tibetan languages, the development of Chinese writing, the formation of regional dialects, and the expansion of political states are related to population history, but they are not identical to it. This distinction becomes even more important when we discuss early Chinese civilizations. Archaeological cultures can spread without large migrations. Political systems can expand through conquest. Technologies can spread through trade. Languages can spread through prestige. And genes can move through family formation. Sometimes all of these processes happen together. Sometimes they do not. Ancient DNA helps separate them. And what it reveals in China is a combination of continuity and change. The Yellow River populations remained important, but they interacted with southern groups. The Northeast remained connected. The Tibetan Plateau developed its own history. Rome changed genetically while Roman culture continued. That is why the modern genetic pattern is both unified and diverse. The unity comes from shared ancestry and centuries of interaction. The diversity comes from regional populations that retained their own genetic histories. This may be one of the strongest lessons ancient DNA can offer. A shared identity does not require identical ancestry. People do not need to be genetically identical to become part of the same cultural world. They need connections, language, institutions, family, trade, political organization, shared traditions, and time. Chinese history provides all of these, and the DNA shows the biological side of that process. But there is still a mystery beneath the mystery. Who were the populations living in China before the first major farming expansions? Some ancient East Asian hunter-gatherer populations are genetically connected to later populations, but the full picture remains incomplete. Some lineages may have disappeared. That is the real genetic origin story. And perhaps the next discovery will make it even more surprising. Scientists may find a previously unknown migration. They may recover DNA from a region where no genome has ever been recovered before. They may finally identify the genetic legacy of populations that have so far remained invisible, and that discovery could force us to redraw the map again. That is why ancient DNA is so important. It lets us separate these different kinds of movement. And China offers one of the most extraordinary examples of all. A civilization with remarkable cultural continuity can still be genetically complex. A population can contain multiple ancient ancestries, while sharing a strong modern identity. A region can absorb migrants without losing all of its earlier population, and a language can spread far beyond the genetic boundaries of the population that first spoke it. These are not contradictions. They are the normal mechanisms of human history. The Chinese story simply happened on an enormous scale. That is why the genetic evidence feels so powerful. And it shows that the people who built the foundations of Chinese civilization were themselves part of an enormous web of human movement. So when you look at modern Chinese DNA, you are not looking at one ancient signature. The final mystery is therefore not simply where Chinese people came from. The deeper mystery is how all these different ancient populations became connected strongly enough to create one of the world's largest and most enduring cultural identities. The answer appears to involve geography, agriculture, migration, political expansion, and cultural integration working together over thousands of years. If this discovery surprised you, subscribe to the channel because the next ancient DNA mystery could take us somewhere even more unexpected. The same techniques that are revealing the hidden population history of China are now being used to investigate the origins of other major populations across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And one question remains. Before the great farming populations expanded across East Asia, who were the people already living there? How much of their ancestry survived? Were some of them completely absorbed into later populations? And could the DNA of modern Chinese people still contain traces of those forgotten communities? That may be the next major discovery. Because the deeper scientists look, the clearer one thing becomes. The genetic history of the Chinese people was never a simple line. It was always a network, and the DNA is finally allowing us to see it.